The fog came off the water like a shroud, clinging to the ruined skeletons of Baltimore's East Harbor. This early, the city was silent, save for the mournful cry of a distant foghorn and the drip of condensation from rusted gantries. This place had once been the beating heart of an empire built on shadows and whispers, a place where men made fortunes and enemies disappeared. Now, it was just a graveyard of brick and steel, haunted by the ghosts of industry. From a narrow apartment building whose facade was shedding paint like dead skin, Elena Vance emerged. She was 29, but the last 6 months had etched shadows under her eyes that belonged to a much older woman. She pulled the thin collar of her coat tighter. It was clean, but frayed at the cuffs, much like her life. Her gaze swept the harbor, a landscape of decay that mirrored the hollowness inside her. On her left hand, the gold was dull, but she twisted the simple wedding band compulsively. It was the only thing of value she had left from Michael, the only tangible proof of a life that had been violently extinguished. Michael, shot dead on a wet street corner for getting involved with the wrong people. That was what the police report hinted at, a polite euphemism for the web of corruption that held the city captive. Elena walked, forgoing a bus she couldn't afford. Her destination was the city courthouse, a granite beast of a building that promised justice, but usually delivered bureaucracy. She was there for the auction, a small, forgotten parcel of land near the old shipyards, registered in Michael's name. It was nothing, a sliver of forgotten property, but it was his. It was the last thread. She planned to use the meager payout to finally leave this city, to outrun the memory of sirens and the scent of iron. The auction room was predictably drab, filled with the city's bottom feeders and a few bored city officials. Elena took a seat in the back, clutching her purse. When her lot number was called, she stood, her heart a cold knot. Lot 42B, the auctioneer droned, shuffling papers. He paused, looking confused, then annoyed. He looked up, scanning the room, and his eyes landed on a man in the front row Elena hadn't noticed. Apologies. There seems to be an error in the listing. This property is no longer available for public auction. Elena's breath caught. But that's not possible. I'm the executor. The auctioneer visibly flinched, not at her, but at someone behind her. The property was acquired this morning, ma'am, a private cash purchase. Cash. The word felt like ash in her mouth. Who? A low, smooth voice cut through the stale air. That would be me. Elena turned. He was standing in the aisle, having risen from the front row. He wore a suit of such impeccable tailoring it seemed to suck the light from the room. It was midnight blue, crisp, and probably worth more than her apartment building. The man was tall, with dark hair swept back from a face that was all sharp angles and cold control. He looked at the auctioneer, not at her, but it was his smile, a faint, chilling lift at one corner of his mouth that stopped her blood. Damian Rourke. The name echoed in her head with the force of a gunshot. Head of the Iron Vow Syndicate, the man whose company, Rourke Construction Group, had its logo plastered on every rising skyscraper, every new development, the man who owned the unions, the contracts, and, it was whispered, the politicians. And Elena knew him, not personally, but she knew the name on the ostentatious, insulting floral wreath that had been delivered to Michael's funeral, a spray of white lilies so large it had to be carried by 2 men, with a simple card, deepest condolences, D. Rourke. The sheer audacity of it. The man who likely pulled the strings of the very wrong people who had killed her husband was sending flowers to his grave, and now he was here, buying the last scrap of her husband's memory for cash. Her vision narrowed, the room, the people, the fog outside, it all melted away, leaving only the sight of him. The air crackled, thick with her sudden, undiluted hatred, but beneath it a colder sensation stirred confusion. Why this lot? Why him? Why the wreath? Damian Rourke let his gaze drift from the auctioneer, his eyes skimming over Elena as if she were a piece of furniture, an irrelevant detail. He gave a slight nod to the auctioneer, a dismissal, and turned to leave. His polished shoes silent on the marble. His associates, 2 mountains in suits, moved to flank him. He was almost at the door when he paused, sensing her stare. He turned his head, just slightly. His eyes, the color of cold steel, finally met hers. He saw the fire there. The grief turned to rage. It seemed to amuse him. "Baltimore belongs to men who know how to build it," Damian Rourke said, his voice a quiet rumble that carried across the room. It wasn't an explanation. It was a decree. Elena felt the words land, felt the weight of his arrogance settle over the city. She thought of Michael's body. She thought of the land, her last hope. Absorbed by this man's bottomless greed, the fear she should have felt was burned away by a sudden, icy clarity. She took a step forward. "Then you've never met a woman who knows how to bury it." The words left her lips, low and steady. They hung in the air between them. The half-smile on Damian Rourke's face didn't falter, but it froze. His eyes narrowed, the amusement vanishing, replaced by something else. Recognition. He was not looking at a grieving widow. He was looking at an adversary. For a long, charged moment, they just stared. Ice and fire, the man who owned the city, and the woman who had just declared war with nothing but the clothes on her back and a ghost in her heart. The battle for Baltimore had begun, not in a boardroom or on the docks, but in the silence of a drab auction hall, in a single, locked gaze. The fire from the auction hall had cooled to a hard, cold resolve. Rent was due, and grief didn't pay the bills. Elena Vance, armed with a sharp mind for numbers and a fabricated resume that erased the last 2 years of her grief-stricken unemployment, started hunting. She landed a temporary position through a downtown agency, a simple data entry accounting role. The company was the Rourke Construction Group. She didn't make the connection immediately. Rourke was a name plastered all over the city, as common as the grime on the sidewalks. The office was in a sleek, glass tower that scraped the clouds, a world away from the auction house. It was anonymous, corporate, and, she thought, safe. She was assigned to a gray cubicle in a sea of hundreds, just another temp processing invoices for concrete, steel, and rebar. On her 3rd day, a human resources manager, doing a routine audit of new hires, flagged a resume. It landed on a desk in the penthouse, inside a folder marked discretionary. Damian Rourke looked at the name Elena Vance and the grainy employee ID photo, the woman from the auction hall, the widow. He hadn't placed her until now. He looked at her fabricated work history, noting the easily verifiable but ultimately superficial references. She was lying. She was also smart. He had security footage of her from the auction, her eyes blazing with a defiant fury that he hadn't seen in years. His first instinct was to have her removed, a word, and she would be a ghost. Her keycard deactivated before she even reached the lobby. But he paused. He tapped the photo. She had walked into the lion's den. Either she was profoundly stupid or she was something else entirely. He leaned back in his leather chair, the city sprawling beneath him like a map of his own making. "No," he told his security chief. "Leave her. I want to know what she does." He switched the small private monitor on his desk to feed C14, the camera angled directly at her cubicle. "Put a flag on her network access. I want to see every key she strokes." Elena, oblivious to the eye in the sky, worked with a grim efficiency. The numbers were her solace. They were logical, absolute. But after a week, the logic began to fray. She was reconciling accounts for community redevelopment projects, massive invoices for materials and labor in neighborhoods that were still visibly decaying. The numbers were inflated, rounded, and coded to shell companies she couldn't find in any public database. She worked late, the office emptying, the only sound the click of her keyboard. She started mapping it out on a personal spreadsheet, a secret file hidden within the temp drive. She saw the pattern $millions, laundered through the very act of rebuilding the city. It was brilliant, it was obscene, and it smelled like the same corruption that had swallowed Michael. In the penthouse, Damien watched. He saw her skip lunch, saw her eyes narrow in concentration, saw her discreetly photograph a ledger with her phone when she thought no one was looking. He felt a strange, unfamiliar flicker of respect. She wasn't a bottom feeder. She wasn't one of the sirens who threw themselves at his power, desperate for a taste. She was a hunter, and she was hunting him. He found himself more intrigued by her quiet investigation than by any billion-dollar deal on his plate. The city was dark when Elena finally left the tower, her mind buzzing. The fall air was sharp, and she pulled her coat tight, walking fast toward the bus stop. She was 2 blocks away when the car, a dark, nondescript sedan, mounted the curb, cutting her off. 2 men climbed out. They weren't polished like Rourke's men. They were rough, wearing the desperation of the streets. "Nice purse, lady," one of them sneered, stepping into her path. "Phone, too. Hand it over." Elena's blood ran cold. She fumbled, her hands shaking. "I don't have any money." "We'll be the judge of that." The second man grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her bicep. She opened her mouth to scream, but a black-gloved hand clamped over her face from behind, not from the men, but from someone else, a third man, a fourth. It was over in what felt like a single, violent exhale. She heard a sickening crunch, a wet gasp. The man holding her arm was suddenly gone, spun around and slammed into the car. The first man was on the ground, unmoving. The entire event took, perhaps, 30 seconds. The hand left her mouth. Elena stumbled back, gasping, her heart trying to escape her chest. Damien Rourke stood between her and the 2 downed men. He hadn't even broken a sweat. His midnight blue overcoat was undisturbed. He was breathing as calmly as if he'd just finished a cup of tea. He didn't look at her. He was checking his cuffs, a purely automatic gesture of composure. Elena stared, her terror shifting, colliding with a profound, terrifying confusion. He had appeared from the shadows like a phantom. He had moved with a speed that was not human, and he had saved her. He finally turned. His steel-colored eyes met hers. They were cold, as always, but in the dim orange of the streetlight, she saw something else. Not kindness, not concern, but a raw, territorial protection. It was the look of a wolf who had just dispatched 2 coyotes sniffing at his what? He said nothing. He simply nodded toward the bus stop, a silent order to leave. She found her voice, though it was a reedy whisper. Who were they?" "Scum," he said. His first word to her since the auction. He looked down at the men. The city is full of it. He started to walk away. "Wait," she called out, surprising herself. He stopped, but didn't turn. Why? This time he did turn. He walked back, stopping just a few feet from her. "You should eat." Elena blinked. "What? You're in my building. You look like you're going to collapse. You can't hunt if you're starving." He gestured down the street. "There's a diner. Come." It wasn't a request. She found herself sitting in a booth at a greasy spoon, the smell of old coffee and frying onions thick in the air. Her hands were still shaking. He sat opposite her, perfectly composed, and ordered 2 black coffees. Elena stared at the chipped formica table. Her throat was tight. That was Baltimore," he interrupted, his voice low. The waitress brought the coffee. Elena wrapped her hands around the warm mug. She suddenly recognized the place. The faded photos on the wall, the jukebox in the corner. This was Michael's favorite place," she whispered, the realization hitting her like a punch. Damien didn't react. He just watched her over the rim of his cup. "You knew," she accused, her voice rising. "You brought me here. You sent those flowers. You bought his land. You knew him." Damien set his cup down with a quiet click. The diner's fluorescent light was harsh, but his eyes were in shadow. "Yes, I knew him." "How?" He was silent for a long time, the only sound the distant sizzle from the grill. Michael Vance was a good man. He was a city inspector. He saw something he shouldn't have, a structural issue, on one of my sites years ago, before I owned everything. Elena held her breath. He could have shut me down. He could have ruined me. I was leveraged to the hilt. But he didn't. He came to me, man to man. He gave me 24 hours to fix it. He saved my company. Damien looked past her, at a memory. I owed your husband a life, and I never got to repay him. The hatred in Elena's chest, the hard, cold thing that had been her companion for 6 months, suddenly fractured. It didn't disappear, but something else flooded in, something warm and confusing and terrifying. He wasn't a monster, he was complicated. He was a man who understood debt. She looked at him, really looked at him. The power, the coldness, it was all there. But so was this honor. So you saved me, she said, to repay the debt. I saved you because you were reckless, he countered, the coldness snapping back. You're digging, Mrs. Vance, in my company, with my access. You knew. I've known since you clocked in. I was curious. His gaze pinned her. Now, I'm concerned. The men who killed your husband, they're not like the animals on the street. They wear suits, and they don't like being hunted. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more menacing than any shout. If you're planning revenge, if you're planning to use my company to find it, I won't stop you. Elena's heart hammered. But if you're going to do it, Damien Rourke said, his steel eyes holding a promise of absolute violence. At least live long enough to see it through, because next time, I might not be there to pull you out of the fire. The promotion was not a request, it was an execution. Elena arrived one morning to find her cubicle packed, a curt email from Human Resources informing her of a restructuring. She was to report to the 45th floor, the penthouse floor. Her new office was not an office, it was a glass-walled antechamber. It connected directly to his. She had a desk, a terminal, and a direct two-way view of Damien Rourke. He had moved his personal accountant, a man with eyes like a dead fish, to another department. Elena was now, officially, the chief accountant for the Rourke Construction Group. She was a watchdog on a leash, brought right into the master's study. She realized, a test. He was either testing her loyalty, her fear, or her competence, or perhaps all three. You'll be joining me for the quarterly planning session, he stated, not looking up from a set of blueprints as she stood in his doorway, her box of meager belongings in her hands. I'm not familiar with the quarterly. You are now 3 o'clock, the main conference room. The quarterly planning session was not about construction. It was a gathering of the city's true architects, the head of the Port Authority, a private equity billionaire, a city councilman with a predatory smile, and 2 other men whose affiliations Elena could only guess at. They were the men who decided which neighborhoods were redeveloped and which were left to rot. Damien sat at the head of the massive mahogany table, a king holding court, and he had placed Elena directly to his right, in the seat reserved for his most trusted advisor. The men looked at her, their eyes calculating, dismissive, a woman, a new, pretty face. Elena said nothing. She opened a leather-bound folio left on her new desk this morning and uncapped a pen. She took notes. Damien was a master. He didn't cajole. He didn't threaten. He simply stated the facts as he saw them. The harbor project will break ground in May, he said. The Port Authority head, who had been loudly protesting the timeline in the media, simply nodded. The zoning for the west side will be reclassified as mixed use, he continued. The councilman smiled and made a note. He controlled them all with an invisible, unbreakable force. It was the power of mutual, assured destruction. He had something on every one of them. Elena wrote, her face a mask of professional placidity. But she was watching. She saw the tremor in the billionaire's hand as he lit a cigar. She saw the sheen of sweat on the councilman's upper lip, and she saw Damien. From his penthouse, Damien had watched her on a screen. Now, she was 3 feet away. He could smell the faint, clean scent of her soap, a stark contrast to the expensive, cloying colognes of the men around him. He spoke, his voice filling the room, but a fraction of his attention was fixed on her. She never flinched. She never looked impressed. Her gaze was steady, analytical. She was not just recording numbers. She was assessing weaknesses. While these other men saw him as a shark, she was looking at him like a specimen under glass. Her quiet, unrelenting focus was more unsettling than any threat he had ever received. The meeting dissolved. The men filed out, obsequious in their goodbyes to Damien, ignoring Elena completely soon. It was just the two of them, the room smelling of stale smoke and ambition. "My car is waiting," Elena said, closing her folio. "A moment, Mrs. Vance," Damien said, standing. "My office." He didn't wait for her reply, just walked through the connecting door. She followed. His private office was a vault of glass, 3 walls of floor-to-ceiling windows that presented Baltimore as a glittering, conquered jewel. The lights were low, the city itself providing the illumination. He stood in the center, a dark silhouette against the skyline. He didn't speak, just waited. He wanted her to break the silence. She wouldn't. She walked to the window, her gaze sweeping over the pinpricks of light. "It's quite a view. You can see everything from here, the harbor, the stadiums, even the blight." "You see blight," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I see potential. I see what's broken, and I fix it." Elena turned to him. "You think you own Baltimore?" His shadow moved. He stepped into a sliver of moonlight. "I bought it. Every street, every man, every bad piece of debt. If it has a price, I've paid it." A small, mirthless laugh escaped her. It was a sound that surprised them both. "You're wrong," she said, her voice soft, but carrying across the vast room. "No one truly owns a place where they've spilled blood." The words hung in the air, sharp as broken glass. The only sound was the faint, high-pitched whistle of the wind pressing against the thick panes. 45 stories up. Damien's composure was absolute, a mask of stone, but a flicker in his eyes betrayed the hit. He moved, not fast, but with a deliberate, predatory grace. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of her. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. The space between them vanished, collapsing into a field of pure energy. Elena didn't retreat. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, the static in the air. He was close enough that she could see the complex gray of his irises, close enough that when she inhaled, she breathed the same air he had just exhaled. Her heart, which had been so steady during the meeting, began a heavy, painful drumming against her ribs. His gaze dropped, just for a second, to her mouth. She felt it like a physical touch. This was the true power, she realized. Not the money, not the violence, this suffocating, controlled intimacy. The dim light from the city below reflected in their eyes. 2 pairs of stars burning in the dark, the line between them, the one drawn in hatred and grief, blurred. It was no longer just about Michael. It was about the man who owed Michael a life, and the woman who had come to collect. And in this moment, beneath the surface, something else stirred. A dark, unwelcome, powerful recognition, a pull. Elena was the first to break. She had to. Another second, and she wasn't sure what she would do, slap him, or reach for him. She took a single, sharp step back, reclaiming the air. "You can't buy back sin with skyscrapers. Mr. Rourke," she said. Her voice was steady, but her pulse was a wild thing in her throat, no matter how tall you build them. She turned, her heels clicking on the marble, and walked out of the office, leaving him alone with his city. Damien Rourke did not move for a very long time. He watched her reflection in the glass as she disappeared. He stared out at the millions of lights, the empire he had built with his own 2 hands. He had been threatened by killers, by billionaires, by politicians. None of it had ever touched him. But the widow's words she hadn't come at him with a weapon. She had come at him with the truth, He placed a hand on the cold glass. His fingers splayed, for the first time since he was a starving kid on those same streets below. Damien Rourke felt the solid ground beneath his feet begin to shift. The new access came with a new set of keys. As chief accountant, Elena now had master-level clearance to the Rourke Group's servers, not just the polished, public-facing financials, but the deep, archived ledgers from his first acquisitions. She worked for 3 nights straight, fueled by black coffee and a cold, burning sense of purpose. It was on the 3rd night, close to 3 a.m., that she found it. It was buried in a legacy server, in a holding company account that had been dissolved 5 years prior. A single, anomalous transaction, a wire transfer for $5 million. It was coded as a consulting fee. The date was 2 days after Michael's murder. The recipient was a numbered account, but the name on the internal authorization was a trigger. A man named Petru. She had seen that name in the buried police file, a transient, a low-level ghost the cops had never found. The money had come from Damien's empire. The money had gone to her husband's killer. She traced the authorization. It led to a satellite company, Harbor Logistics, a name she'd seen before in the redevelopment ledgers. It was a brick-and-mortar place, not just a digital ghost. In the penthouse, Damien watched her screen. He saw the cursor hover over the transaction. He had left this digital breadcrumb, this unscrubbed file, knowing she would eventually find it. His security chief, a man named Victor Kane, stood beside him, his face impassive. "She's there," Victor stated, his voice a gravelly monotone. "She's too close. Let me handle it. A clean severance, a tragic accident." Damien stared at the screen, at the woman who was systematically dismantling his defenses. "No," Damien said. "She's not too close. She's exactly where I need her to be." He turned to his own terminal and, with a few keystrokes, accidentally sent a misdirected email. It was meant for the legal department, a file containing encrypted access keys for old company properties. He sent it to Elena. An hour later, Elena was packing her bag. She had the key. She had the address for Harbor Logistics. She was going. The parking garage was cold, the concrete amplifying the sound of her heels on the wet pavement. A hard, driving rain had begun, turning the city into a wash of neon and shadow. She was fumbling for her keys when the stairwell door scraped open. It wasn't a mugger. This man didn't speak. He wore a dark rain jacket, and he moved with a fluid, terrifying purpose. In his hand, he held a pistol, fitted with a heavy cylindrical silencer. Elena froze, a scream dying in her throat. A black shadow detached itself from the pillar behind her. Damien. He wasn't in a suit. He was dressed in black, like the rain itself. The silenced pistol was never raised. Damien moved with a speed that defied logic, a blur of focused, brutal violence. It wasn't a brawl. It was an execution. He had a knife. The sound of the blade meeting a new home was a sickening, wet sound that was swallowed by the storm. The man gurgled, eyes wide with a shock that would never fade, and collapsed. Elena was pressed against the side of her car, her hand over her mouth, her entire body shaking. Damien stood over the body, his chest heaving, not from exertion, but from a cold, controlled rage. He knew this man, one of Victor's best, an internal message. He turned to Elena. His face was a mask of shadow, his eyes glittering in the dim light. The rain was torrential now, sweeping into the garage, plastering his hair to his skull. "Did you—" Elena's voice was a ragged gasp. "Did you kill him to hide this or to save me?" Damien took a step toward her, wiping the blade on his pants. He looked from the dead man back to her, and the truth of the moment hung between them. Raw and terrible. I'm asking myself the same thing. Headlights suddenly flashed at the garage entrance. A black SUV. Not police. Worse. "We have to go. Now." He didn't wait for her. He grabbed her arm, pulling her away from her car, away from the body and toward his own, parked in the shadows. They were in the car and speeding out a back ramp before the SUV had even stopped. He drove fast, his knuckles white on the wheel, the windshield wipers battling the deluge. He took them deep into the industrial sector, to the same desolate, haunted harbor where this had all begun. He wrenched the car to a halt behind a row of dilapidated buildings and cut the engine. The silence was deafening, filled only by the roar of the rain on the car roof. He got out, pulling her with him. He jimmied the lock on a massive corrugated steel door, and they fell into the black, echoing expanse of an abandoned warehouse. The air was frigid, smelling of salt, rust, and decay. They were both soaked to the bone, adrenaline crashing, leaving them shivering and exposed. Elena's teeth chattered. Damien ran a hand through his wet hair, the water dripping onto the floor. He had a long, shallow cut on his forearm, bleeding sluggishly. He had used his arm to block the man's initial grab. Elena saw the blood, without thinking, the shock giving way to a strange, automatic focus. She stepped toward him. "You're hurt." Before he could react, she tore a strip of fabric from the hem of her own soaked blouse. Her fingers, numb and shaking, went to his arm. The moment her skin touched his, a different kind of electricity arced between them, hotter and more dangerous than the storm. He grabbed her wrist, his grip like a steel trap. "What are you doing?" His voice was rough, a low growl. "You're bleeding." He was gonna kill you, Elena," he snarled, and pulling her closer, his face inches from hers. "And you know why. You know what you found, what I let you find." You bastard," she whispered, the tears finally coming, hot and angry, mixing with the rainwater on her face. "You let him come for me. You let this happen." "I let you get close," he breathed, his other hand coming up to grip her jaw, forcing her to look at him. The smell of the rain, the iron from his blood, the sheer animal presence of him, it overwhelmed her. "I underestimated Victor. I didn't think he'd move on you." "Liar," she sobbed, and she hit him. Her fist connected with his solid chest, a desperate, frantic blow. "Liar," she hit him again. He took the blows, unmoving. Then he caught her wrists, caging her against the cold steel of his body. "Stop." "I hate you," she cried, her voice breaking. "You've ruined everything." "I know," he said, and his voice was raw with a guilt she couldn't understand. The hatred, the grief, the terror, and the undeniable, suffocating pull that had been simmering for weeks, it all exploded. He was the one man she should despise, and the only one who seemed to understand the darkness. He didn't let go. He stared at her, and in his eyes, she saw her own brokenness reflected. He was the one who moved first. His mouth crashed down on hers. It was not a kiss. It was a collision. It was desperate, angry, and utterly possessive. It was the taste of rain and guilt and a loneliness so profound it swallowed them both. Elena's hands, still trapped in his, clenched, and then, in a moment of sheer, self-destructive surrender, they opened, her fingers clawing at his jacket, pulling him closer. It was a kiss of shared sin. He lifted her, her back pressing against a cold, rusted support beam, and the world tilted. His hands were in her wet hair, tilting her head back, his mouth plundering hers, fierce and demanding. She met his intensity with her own, a mirror of his desperation. This was not love. It was something far more primal. It was the frantic, gasping need to feel something other than pain, to be alive in the face of death. They clung to each other in the darkness, two drowning people using each other for air, the storm raging outside and in. When it finally broke, they were left breathless, leaning against each other, the cold air rushing back in. The adrenaline was gone, leaving only the stark, awful reality. Elena slowly untangled herself, her body shaking with a new, deeper chill. She looked at him, the man who had just saved her, the man who had just kissed her, the man who had paid her husband's killer. "You just saved my life," she whispered, her voice hollow and dead. He watched her, his expression unreadable, his chest still rising and falling. "But you're still the man," she continued, her voice gaining a sharp, broken edge. "Who is responsible for costing me everything?" Damien Rourke looked at the woman he had just pulled from the fire, the woman he had just held as if she were his own. He wanted to tell her. He wanted to explain, but the truth was a loaded gun, and he was not yet ready to fire it. He said nothing, just watched her, his eyes heavy with the weight of the secrets he still kept, and the city that demanded blood for every inch of peace. The warehouse left a scar. The rain had washed away the blood, but the memory of his touch, the violence of his kiss, was branded onto her skin. Elena returned to the glass tower, but she was a different woman. The line between hunter and hunted, between justice and obsession, had been irrevocably blurred. She avoided him, and he, in turn, seemed to be consumed by a new, urgent fire. The Rourke construction group was in a state of high alert. Though it was invisible to the outside world, the air in the penthouse was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with her. Damien was at war. Whispers in the elevator, hushed calls in the hallway. Elena pieced it together. The Lasker Syndicate, a rival faction from the south, was making a move. Damien's empire was under attack, and he was responding with the full, silent force of his organization. He was a ghost in the office, his focus absolute. This distraction, this war, gave Elena the cover she needed. She had to know. The kiss, the murder in the garage, it had all been a chaotic, emotional storm. She needed the cold, hard truth. She went back to the servers, but this time she wasn't looking for money. She was looking for Michael. She found the file hidden in Damien's personal server, masked as a geotechnical survey report. It wasn't a financial ledger, it was surveillance. Photos, reports, and timelines, all centered on Michael. Damien hadn't just known about the murder. He had been watching Michael for months before it happened. He had compiled a dossier. And then, the final, damning piece, a copy of the official police report, but it was a version she had never seen. This one was unredacted. It contained witness statements that had been lost from the official file, statements that pointed not to a random transient named Petru, but to a coordinated, professional hit. Damien hadn't just paid the killer, he had actively suppressed the evidence that would have led to the real masterminds. He had buried the truth to protect his empire. The $5 million wasn't a payout, it was a cleanup fee. The last of her confusion evaporated, replaced by a devastating, cold clarity. The man who had saved her, the man who had kissed her, was complicit. His debt to Michael was a lie, he told himself, a justification for the monster he was. He had let her get close, played with her, perhaps even felt a flicker of something real. But in the end, his empire, built on blood and lies, came first. The betrayal was a duty. It was the only justice Michael would ever get. While Damien was fighting his war with the Laskers, Elena started her own. She used her position, her total access. She was meticulous. She copied everything: the hidden ledgers, the shell company accounts, the wire transfers, and the unredacted report on Michael. She bundled a decade's worth of the Iron Vow's sins into one encrypted file. She sent it anonymously to the only people who could fight a monster of Damien's size, the FBI. The raid was scheduled to hit a central processing warehouse on the west side, a known hub for the Iron Vow's cash laundering operations. Elena's intel suggested Damien would be there, meeting with his lieutenants to coordinate his war against the Laskers. The FBI descended at dusk, a swarm of black vehicles and armored agents, but something was wrong. The warehouse, usually bustling, was silent. The agents breached the doors to find a cold, empty cavern. He had known. Elena was in her apartment, her bag packed, ready to disappear, when her door opened, not kicked in, opened with a key. Damien Rourke stood in the doorway, framed by the dim hall light. He was not in a suit. He was dressed in the same black, practical attire he'd worn in the garage, as if ready for a fight. He was alone. "They found nothing," he said. It wasn't a question. A perfect tip, a perfect location, and an empty box. You cleaned me out, Elena. But you also tipped them off too early. You wanted him caught, but you also wanted... what? For me to escape. I wanted justice, she said, her voice shaking, her hand moving to the nightstand. There was a gun there, one she had bought after Michael's death, one she had never touched. Justice, he scoffed. Stepping into the room, he saw the gun. He didn't react. Is that what you call it, feeding me to the feds while I'm fighting a war on a second front? It was brilliant. Victor was impressed. Victor, my head of security, the man who's been trying to convince me to put a bullet in your head since the day you walked into my building. The man who killed your husband. Elena's blood froze. You're lying. Am I? Damien walked closer, his eyes hollow. He did it without my order, to protect the syndicate from an inspector who was getting too close. The man I owed my life to. I couldn't bring him back. So I buried the truth. I paid the killer to disappear. I hid it all. He was inches from her now, the same suffocating proximity. I hid it to protect my organization. Yes, but I also hid it because I couldn't face what I'd allowed to happen, what I had built. He saw her hand on the gun. He didn't move to stop her. His eyes were bleak, stripped of all arrogance, all power. There was only a vast, cold emptiness. He touched his own chest, right over his heart. If you're going to shoot, Elena, he whispered, his voice raw, do it. But shoot the heart. It's already yours. Her hand trembled. This was it. The moment. Pull the trigger. End the monster. End the man. End the pain. She couldn't... A sob, a wretched, tearing sound, escaped her. Her hand fell away from the gun. Damien's expression didn't change, but his eyes closed for a fraction of a second, a moment of profound, silent defeat. He had his answer. His phone buzzed, a single, sharp alert. He looked at it. They're coming, not the feds. Victor, he's cleaning house. He knows about you. He knows I'm here. He turned to leave. Get out of the city. Now. Elena, run. He was at the door when she found her voice. Damien. He paused, his back to her. She said nothing. She couldn't. He walked out. She ran to the window. She watched him get into his car. He sped off, heading not for the safety of his tower, but back toward the industrial sector, back toward the warehouse. Minutes later, a flash lit up the western skyline. A low, concussive boom followed, rattling the glass in her window. A massive plume of orange and black smoke climbed into the night sky, originating from the exact location of the warehouse. He had gone there to meet Victor. He had gone there, knowing it was a trap. Elena stood, her hand pressed against the cold glass, watching the fire consume a part of the city. She watched as her betrayer, her savior, her monster was erased. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent, a baptism of smoke and grief. If you were truly a demon, she whispered to the rising smoke, it would have been so much easier to forget you. 6 months, 184 days. Elena Vance measured her life in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the FBI's Baltimore field office. After the fire, after the explosion that had vaporized Damien Rourke and crippled the Iron Vow, she had been a person of intense interest. She had given them everything, the complete, unvarnished architecture of the syndicate she had mapped. They had, in turn, offered her a position civilian consultant. She was a ghost of a different kind, respected for her insight, but kept at arm's length, a woman who had walked through the fire and smelled of smoke. She lived alone, in a new, secure apartment. She worked, she ate, she slept. The hatred, the passion, the grief, it had all been cauterized in the blast that lit up the western skyline. She believed Damien was dead because she had to. The alternative was too complex, the wound too deep to reopen. The city, however, does not mourn. It adapts. With Damien Rourke and his enforcer Victor Kane both gone, the power vacuum had been filled by a dozen smaller, greedier predators, the Lasker Syndicate, The remaining harbor bosses, they had started a bloody, chaotic war for the scraps. Then, 2 weeks ago, the war had stopped. It had stopped because the combatants began to disappear. A loan shark, found encased in a new sidewalk, a rival boss vanishing from a locked room. The chaos was being replaced by a cold, surgical precision. "It's the Rourke ghost," Agent Miller, her FBI handler, said over coffee. He meant it as a joke. "Someone's cleaning house. Rourke style? Too bad he's ashes." Elena didn't smile. She'd been studying the case files. It wasn't Rourke style. It was Damien. The moves were not just efficient, they were arrogant. He wasn't just removing rivals. He was making statements. She saw his signature, the invisible hand of a master, and it made her blood run cold. She was seeing a ghost. She was leaving the federal building late one evening, the sky a bruised purple, when her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown, blocked number, just 9 words. "You're not the only one who owns this city." Elena stopped dead on the plaza, the phone falling from her numb fingers. It was her line, the words she had thrown at him in the auction hall, the words that had started it all. Her heart hammered, a painful, frantic bird in her chest. It was a prank. It had to be. A cruel, sick joke from some old syndicate loyalist. She ran home, double-locking her door, her newfound peace shattering like glass. She leaned against the door, gasping, telling herself it was impossible. And then she saw it. On her kitchen table, a place no one had access to, sat a bottle of wine. It was not a brand she drank. It was a 1998 Chateau Valois, the vintage Damien kept in his penthouse office, the one he had been drinking the night she confronted him. She backed away, a hand flying to her mouth. He wasn't dead. He was alive, and he had been in her apartment. The ghost was real. The next few days were a blur of paranoia. She saw him in every shadow, in the face of every stranger. The music, she heard a piece of obscure classical music he'd had on in his office playing from a passing car. She was being haunted, systematically. She knew where it would end. She knew where he would be. She went to the cemetery, not the new, manicured lawn where her parents were, but the old, Gothic one near the harbor, where Michael was buried. The fog was rolling in off the water, just as it had that first morning. It was a night for ghosts. She stood at Michael's grave, the simple granite headstone cold to the touch. "I don't know what to do," she whispered into the mist. "He's alive. After everything, he's alive, Michael, and I think I'm losing my mind." "You are not," a voice said. It was low, rougher than she remembered, and it came from the fog right behind her. Elena turned slowly. He stepped from the mist, a shadow resolving into a man. It was not the king in the bespoke suit. This man was leaner, harder. A faint white scar traced his jawline, a permanent reminder of the fire. He wore a simple black coat, and his eyes were the same. Cold steel, and they were fixed on her, drinking her in. Damien Rourke was alive. She stared, her mind unable to process the sight, the man she had betrayed, the man she had kissed, the man she had mourned. "You," she breathed, her voice a reedy whisper. "You're dead. I saw the fire. The report, your DNA." "Victor was thorough," Damien said, his voice a quiet rumble. "He planted a body from the morgue. He wanted the world to believe I was gone so he could take it all. He took a step. He didn't plan on you." The air left her lungs, all the held-back grief, not for Michael, but for him. The 6 months of cold, empty peace she had built on the foundation of his death, it all came rushing up. The anger was a physical, burning thing. "You let me," she whispered, her voice rising, cracking. "You let me believe you were dead. I saw the smoke. She crossed the 3 feet between them in an instant. Her hand cracked across his face, the sound sharp and brutal in the sacred silence of the graveyard. He didn't move, and he didn't even flinch. He just watched her, his newly scarred jaw taking the full force of her rage. The slap broke the spell. It broke her. The anger, so vast and consuming, collapsed, and underneath it was a crater of raw, agonizing need. He was alive. The one person on earth who understood the darkness in her, the man who was her sin and her absolution, was alive. A sob, a tearing, animal sound, ripped from her throat, her hand, still stinging, didn't pull back. It clenched into a fist, grabbing the front of his rough coat. "I hate you!" she cried, and she fell against him, her body slamming into his with the full force of her broken heart. Her other arm came up, her hands fisting his coat as she buried her face against his chest. "I hate you! I hate you so much!" He was solid. He was real. He smelled of the cold night air and smoke. For a long moment, Damien just stood there, letting her hit him, letting her collapse. Then, slowly, as if unsure, his arms came up. They wrapped around her, not in a gentle embrace, but in a binding, possessive grip, a man reclaiming his anchor. One hand buried itself in her hair, holding her head to his chest, the other locked around her waist, pulling her so close the air left her. He said nothing, and he just held her, a living, breathing man, holding a woman who had just realized she was a widow in name only. They stood in the fog, two broken, warring pieces, fused together by violence and an undeniable, terrible belonging. His embrace was a fortress, the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved beneath her feet. Elena clung to him, her breath ragged, the smell of the damp earth and his skin filling her lungs. When he finally, gently, unwound her arms, he kept his hands on her shoulders, holding her steady. "He's been hunting me for a year. Elena," Damien said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "Victor, while I was building, he was poisoning the roots. The explosion was his inauguration. He wanted the feds to believe I was gone, and the street to know he was in charge. You knew. I knew he was a traitor. I didn't know how deep. I went to that warehouse to end him. He sent a dozen men, and a bomb as a backup. He underestimated me." He touched the scar on his jaw. "But not by much. I've spent the last 6 months as a ghost, living in the guts of this city, dismantling what he's trying to hold. Those bosses who disappeared, they were loyal to him. He had been fighting a war she didn't even know existed." He led her from the cemetery, not to a car, but to a rusted grate hidden by overgrown ivy. It opened onto a dark, descending staircase. They were in the city's forgotten veins, an old service tunnel. His safe house was a dry, reinforced chamber, lit by a string of bare bulbs running off a car battery. It was filled with maps, computer monitors, and weapons. "You have to go," he said, turning to her, his face grim in the harsh light. "He knows you're back. He knows you're my weakness. I'll get you a car. Money, disappear." Elena looked at the man who had crawled back from the dead, the man living in a concrete tomb, all to reclaim an empire she despised. "No," she said. "This is not a discussion. He's not a businessman, Elena. He's a rabid dog. He's the man who murdered your husband in cold blood. He will not hesitate." "I know," she said, her voice quiet but unbending. "You should testify. Damien, come to Miller. We can put him away." "Put him away," Damien laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Victor is the system now. He has a dozen cops on his payroll, 2 judges. You can't arrest a man who knows the raid is coming before you do. The only way to stop him is to cut his head off. And I will. And then what? You become king again, the iron vow rises, and nothing changes. Go, he ordered, his voice hard. No. She stepped toward him, into his space, just as she had in the penthouse, but this time it wasn't a challenge, it was a declaration. I already lost 1 husband to the shadows of this city. I am not losing another one because he's too proud to ask for help. The words struck him silent. He stared at her, the mask of the syndicate boss cracking, revealing the man underneath. You're not a ghost, Damien, she said, her voice softening. You're a man, and you can't do this alone. He's running your company. I know your books. I know where the money is. I know your digital footprint, and I know what the FBI is looking for. You want to cut the head off, I can help you find the neck. They became partners in the darkness. For 2 weeks, they lived in the tunnels, surfacing only at night. They were a two-person army. She brought the surgical precision of the forensic accountant. He brought the brutal strategy of a king. She mapped Victor's new financial network, identifying the weak points, the accounts he was using to pay his new enforcers. He used that intel to bleed his rival, to turn Victor's own men against him. In the quiet hours, between planning sessions, they talked. He told her about finding Michael's body, a secret he had kept from everyone, the guilt that drove him. She told him about the 6 months of numbness, working for the FBI, pretending he was dead, an act of self-preservation. They shared stale crackers and cold coffee, their wounds, their memories. The trust, broken by betrayal and fire, was slowly, painfully rebuilt. The night before the final plan was to be set in motion, the tension was unbearable. They had a viable plan, a way to corner Victor, but it was a long shot, a desperate gamble. Elena sat on a small cot, tracing the lines on her palm, her mind 1,000 miles away. He was at the monitors, watching a silent feed. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken fear. She was cold, a deep, bone-chilling cold that had nothing to do with the damp tunnel. She stood and walked to him. He didn't turn, but she knew he was aware of her every move. She sat beside him on his own cot, a silent request. He finally looked at her, his steel eyes softened by exhaustion. He said nothing, just opened his arm. She lay down, curling into his side, and he wrapped his arm around her. It was not the desperate, angry passion of the warehouse. This was something new. It was quiet, tender, and achingly sad. It was the embrace of two people who knew this was the only peace they might ever get, a temporary shelter from the storm they were about to unleash. He kissed her forehead, a gesture of pure, unadulterated care. "We will see the dawn, Elena," he whispered. "I know," she said. His hand traced the side of her face, his calloused fingers gentle. He looked at her, truly saw her, and she saw him. The boss, the ghost, the man. They came together not in a clash, but in a quiet, deliberate surrender, a promise to be human for one more night, holding back the darkness for a few precious, borrowed hours. It was the next morning. The sickness she had been blaming on stress and bad coffee returned, sudden and violent. She barely made it to a waste bin. Damien was at her side in an instant, eye holding her hair back, a hand on her back. When the wave passed, she sat back, her whole body shaking. She was pale, her mind racing, counting, the dates, the warehouse, the 6 months, the 2 weeks. The math was sudden, irrefutable and terrifying. "Damien," she whispered, her hand moving from her mouth to her stomach. He was kneeling in front of her, his brow furrowed in concern. "What is it? Are you ill?" She looked into his eyes, and the entire war, Victor, the city, it all fell away. I think," she said, her voice trembling, "I think I'm pregnant." His hand froze on her back. He stopped breathing. The stunned silence was louder than any explosion. She saw a universe of emotions pass through his eyes, disbelief, then a flash of pure, unbridled joy so bright it terrified her. And then, just as quickly, it was extinguished, replaced by a deep, profound, animal fear. He stood up, stumbling back, as if she had physically wounded him. He turned away from her, running a hand through his hair, his body vibrating with a new, terrible energy. "No," he growled. "No, not now. Not like this." He slammed his fist into the concrete wall, a crack of bone against stone. "I swore," he choked out, his voice raw with a pain she'd never heard. "I swore I would never, ever let a child of mine be born into this, into my darkness." He was a lion in a cage, a man just given the one thing he truly wanted, in the one way he could never accept. Elena stood up, slowly, her own fear eclipsed by a sudden, fierce strength. She walked to him, to this powerful, broken man, and stood at his back. She didn't touch him, not yet. Damien! He wouldn't look at her. She moved in front of him, forcing his gaze. She took his bloody hand from the wall. Then she placed her other hand flat on his chest, over the heart he claimed was hers. Then we'll light it up. He stared at her, at the fire in her eyes, the defiance that had captivated him from the very beginning. You are not your darkness, Damien, she said, her voice shaking but full of iron. And this baby will not be born in it. It will be born in the city we are about to save. You and I, we will light it up. The news of a child, a life created in the heart of their darkness, changed the stakes. It was no longer about revenge. It was about survival. But the city was not done with them. As Damien and Elena worked, the fragments of the Iron Vow began to reform, not under Victor, but in a new, unexpected shape. While Victor Kane was solidifying his control over the city's corrupt infrastructure, a different kind of power was rising from the streets. They called themselves the Widow's Circle. It was a whisper at first, a support group for women who had lost husbands and sons to the grinder of the city's underworld. They were the collateral damage, the women left behind by men like Damien, like Victor, like Michael. They had been watching Elena. They saw her as the ultimate victim, a woman who had lost her husband, been pulled into the orbit of the monster Damien Rourke, and then been used by the FBI. They saw her as a symbol of their shared pain. One of Elena's few trips to the surface, a run for medical supplies, ended in a quiet street corner confrontation, not with thugs, but with three older, stone-faced women. Elena Vance, one of them said, her voice devoid of emotion. Her name was Maria. She had lost her son to a syndicate turf war 3 years ago. We know what you've done. We know you worked for Rourke. We know you fed him to the feds. He's the devil who built this hell, another said. And you, child, you were his personal Judas. We want you to lead us. Elena was stunned. Lead you? Lead you where? To justice, Maria said, her dark eyes burning. Rourke is gone, but the men who served him are not. Victor Kane, the Laskers, they are the same disease. You know the books, you know the secrets. Help us burn them to the ground, for every woman who has had to bury a man because of them. Elena stood, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. They believed Damien was the source of all their pain. And here they were, asking her, the woman who now carried his child, to be their avenging angel. The irony was a physical sickness. She was torn, her old quest for justice warring with the fierce, protective love for the man she was hiding in the tunnels. She stammered a non-committal answer and fled, the women's disappointed, cold stares following her. She returned to the tunnel, shaken. Damien saw it on her face. Before she could explain, a priority alert flashed on one of his monitors. A trusted, long-time informant, one of the few still loyal to him, was in trouble, promising high-level intel on Victor's main payroll. It's a trap, Elena said instantly, the encounter with the widows sharpening her senses. He's hunting you. Damien, this is too easy. It's a risk, Damien countered, already checking a sidearm. But it's the only one we have. If I can get that payroll data, I can turn half his men. We need it. Then I'm going with you. You won't see the trap. You'll see the target. I'll see the exits. The meet was in a disused brewery, the air thick with the smell of soured hops. It was a trap, not a subtle one, but a blunt force instrument. The moment they stepped onto the rusted catwalk, the floodlights snapped on, bathing them in a harsh, industrial glare. Victor's men, at least 10 of them, appeared from behind vats, their weapons raised. The firefight was instantaneous and brutal. Damien was a ghost in the chaos, moving, firing, a master of violence in his element, but he was outnumbered. Elena, her heart pounding, stayed in the shadows as they had planned. She saw what Damien, in the thick of the fight, did not. A sniper on a higher gantry, raising his rifle, taking a calm, steady aim at the center of Damien's back. There was no time to shout, no time to think. She ran. She launched herself from the shadows, her body colliding with his, a desperate, frantic shove. Damien above. The shove sent him sprawling behind a steel column. The sniper's shot rang out, a sharp crack, but he wasn't the only shooter. A man from the floor level, seeing her, fired a wild burst. Pain, hot and searing, ripped through Elena's side. It was a white, blinding agony that stole her breath. She collapsed, her hands instinctively clutching the wound, a wet, spreading warmth. A roar, a sound of inhuman rage, tore from Damien's throat. The tactical, controlled king was gone, replaced by a pure, primal animal. He moved from behind the column, not as a strategist, but as an executioner. The fight was over in less than a minute, a flurry of precise, vengeful violence. Then, silence, save for the drip of water and Elena's ragged breathing. He was at her side, his hands covered in his enemy's blood, now frantic on hers, trying to stop the bleeding. No, no, no. Elena, stay with me. She was in a private, sterile room, the kind of place money and power kept off the books. A panicked doctor, pulled from his bed, had done his work. The bullet had missed her vital organs, but it had been close. The baby was, for now, miraculously, still safe. Elena was pale, her skin translucent, her breath shallow. Damien sat by the bed, his head in his hands, a man broken. The blood was washed off, but he was still stained. She woke, her eyes fluttering open. She saw him, the guilt radiating from him in waves. "Damien," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He was at her side instantly, his hand taking hers, afraid he would break it. "You saved me," he choked out. "You're a fool," she replied, a faint spark of her old fire. She coughed, the pain making her wince. "You're still trying to be the king, the ghost, the demon." She squeezed his hand, her gaze locking with his, her eyes clear and filled with a terrible, unbending truth. "If you're still going to live like a demon, Damien, then at least let me die as the person who loved you." The words struck him harder than any bullet. She was telling him his path of vengeance, his lone war, would kill her. It would kill the life they had. He bowed his head, his shoulders shaking, and finally, the king broke. He wept, his tears falling on their joined hands. "I can't lose you," he whispered. "I can't lose either of you." "Then stop fighting your war," she said, her voice weak but firm, "and start fighting for our future." He took a deep, shuddering breath. He looked at her, the woman who had taken a bullet for him, the woman carrying his child. It was time. The final, heaviest wall of his fortress had to come down. "Victor Kane," he said, his voice raw. "The man who did this. The man who set the trap. It was him." "I know, Damien." "No," he interrupted. You don't know the whole truth." He closed his eyes. "He was my right hand, my most trusted man. I gave him his first suit. I gave him his power, and he used it. He used it to order the hit on Michael." He finally said it, the last buried sin. "I found out after... I didn't kill him. He was too valuable. I told myself it was business. I told myself I'd handle it. I buried him." He met her gaze. "You were right, Elena. I'm not the man who killed your husband. I'm the man who created the monster that did." Elena finally, truly, understood. It was not Damien she had to forgive. It was the system he had built, and that system was now hunting them all. "All right," she said, the decision forming, absolute and clear. "Then we don't just kill the monster. We burn his whole world down." She looked past him, at the sterile room, at the city outside. "No more tunnels, no more ghosts. We're going to walk into the light. We are going to the FBI. We are going to trade them the one thing they can't get, Victor Kane, on a silver platter, delivered by the ghost himself. And in return, we are going to get our freedom." The bridge was a monument to a lie, christened the Baltimore Rebirth. It was a soaring, elegant arc of white steel and cable, a testament to the city's future. It was also the crown jewel of Damien's old empire, the contract Victor Kane had used to cement his own. Tonight was its grand inauguration, a gala of politicians, media, and the city's elite, all gathered for speeches and fireworks. It was the perfect place for a ghost to make his return. "Command van is in position." Agent Miller's voice was tinny in Elena's earpiece. "All teams are set. We wait for visual confirmation." Elena sat in the back of the dark van, 3 blocks from the epicenter. Her gaze locked on a bank of monitors. Her side was a dull, throbbing ache, a constant reminder of what was at stake. She was the operations nerve center. South Tower is clear. North Platform is green. Ground team, what's your status? "On the move." The voice that came back was low, distorted, and sent a shiver through her despite herself. "I'm in." Damien Rourke, the man who had owned the skyline, was now just another shadow on the ground. He wore the reflective vest and hard hat of a city worker, his face smudged with grease, his gaze sweeping the crowd. He was the bait. Victor Kane, in his moment of ultimate triumph, would never be able to resist the ghosts of his past. "Target acquisition," Miller said, his voice tense. "Black Escalade, 3-car detail, arriving at the main platform." Elena zoomed a camera. Victor Kane stepped out, preening for the cameras, his suit perfect, his smile radiating a false, political charm. He shook the governor's hand. "He's exposed," Miller said, his hand moving to give the signal. "Wait," Elena said, her eyes narrowing. "The detail, it's not his usual team. Those men are too disciplined. Where is his core team?" Damien's voice was ice. "They're not with him. They're here, in the crowd. It's a counter-ambush." Miller, he knew. A man in an identical worker's vest, standing near a generator 50 feet from Damien, turned. Their eyes met. The man's hand went under his vest. "Abort!" Elena screamed. "Damien, get out! It's a trap!" It was too late. The first shot wasn't from a pistol. It was the heavy, thudding report of a high-caliber rifle from a hidden sniper's nest. The bullet shattered the podium where the governor had been standing seconds before. The plaza erupted. The sound of a string quartet was replaced by a chorus of screams. People scattered, a wave of pure, animal panic. Smoke grenades detonated, filling the manicured plaza with a thick, choking fog. "All teams, engage. We are compromised. Engage," Miller yelled into his command mic. Through the chaos, Damien moved. He tore off the vest, a pistol already in his hand. He was a phantom, moving through the smoke and flashing emergency lights, a master of an environment he had helped create. He saw 2 of Kane's men pin down a young FBI agent behind a flimsy row of folding chairs. The agent was hit, clutching his leg, a dark stain spreading. The men advanced, their weapons raised for the kill. "Damien, the south exit is clear. Your escape route," Elena pleaded into the mic, her eyes glued to his feed. Damien saw the wounded agent. He saw the open exit. He saw Michael's face, a fleeting memory of a debt unpaid. He made his choice. He broke cover, not toward the exit, but toward the agent. "Cover!" he yelled. He fired twice, 2 precise, economical shots that dropped Kane's men. He grabbed the agent by his vest, hauling him behind a massive concrete planter. "Pressure on the wound," he ordered, his hands already cinching a tourniquet on the man's thigh with brutal efficiency. He had sacrificed his escape. He was now pinned, in the heart of the fight. Elena watched, her heart in her throat. The van was supposed to be safe. Her mobile overwatch. She never heard the door open. The scream she heard was Miller's. He was ripped from his chair, thrown onto the pavement. Victor Kane stood in the doorway, his immaculate suit smeared with soot, his face a mask of primal fury. "The ghost," he panted, his eyes wild, "and his little shadow." He grabbed Elena by the arm, yanking her from the van, her wound screaming in protest. He clamped an arm around her throat, the cold metal of a pistol pressing against her temple. Rourke Victor's voice was a triumphant roar that cut through the gunfire. He dragged her into the open, under the flashing red and blue lights. "Get out here, you bastard, or I'll put a bullet in the only thing you have left." Damien emerged from the smoke, his weapon steady, his face unreadable. He was 200 feet away. "This is poetry, isn't it?" Victor laughed, tightening his grip. Elena gagged, her fingers clawing weakly at his forearm. "You built this bridge, and you're going to die on it, but not before you watch her go." He pressed the gun hard against Elena's skin. "She's the widow of your sins, Rourke, the one you never cleaned up, and now she's going to pay for them." Damien walked forward, his steps slow, measured. He stopped 20 feet away. He looked at Elena, his eyes conveying a universe of apology. Slowly, his expression unreadable. He bent to one knee. He placed his pistol on the asphalt. He raised his empty hands. "You win. Victor, it's me you want. Let her go." Victor's laugh was high and manic. "I win. Of course I win. I took it all from you, old man. The city, the power, your life." "You took nothing," Damien said, his voice quiet, almost conversational, drawing all of Victor's focus. "You're just a scavenger. You didn't even know she was the one who fed you to the feds." "What?" Victor's grip faltered, his head snapping to look at Elena. It was the only opening she would get. Elena didn't try to pull away. She drove her heel down, hard, on Victor's instep. He roared, his arm spasming. In that split second, her hand shot up. She didn't grab his arm. She grabbed the gun itself, her fingers wrapping over his, her thumb jamming itself behind the trigger. He tried to fire. She shoved. With all her remaining strength, all her grief, all her rage for Michael, for Damien, for herself, she twisted the gun, forcing it up, under his own chin. She forced his finger back. The shot was deafening, a single final punctuation. The plaza, which had been a symphony of chaos, went utterly silent. Victor's eyes were wide, staring at a sky he could no longer see. His grip loosened. He crumpled to the ground, a puppet with his strings cut. At that exact moment, the fireworks, set on an automated timer, finally began. A massive explosion of gold and crimson light flooded the sky. Elena stood, trembling, her hands still raised, frozen. Damien was there. He was moving before Victor's body had settled, catching her as her legs gave way, sweeping her into his arms. The movement tore a gasp from her. He looked down. Her side, where her old wound was now soaked in fresh, dark blood. "He shot me," she whispered, her face pale, confused. It went off." No, Damien whispered, his voice thick, holding her against his chest. The agent Damien had saved was limping toward them, pointing. "Sir, the medevac, it's here." A helicopter, diverted from a hospital, was descending, its searchlight cutting a bright, clean circle in the smoke. Damien ran, carrying her. He climbed in, never looking back at the man, at the life. He was leaving on the bridge. The helicopter lifted, rising above the flashing lights, above the smoke. Damien held her, his hand pressed to her side. "You," Elena whispered, her eyes fluttering, a weak smile touching her lips. "You said, if you're going to shoot the heart." A strangled, broken sound came from Damien's throat. He leaned his forehead against hers. "Just hold on, just hold on." As they climbed, they could see the entire city, a glittering carpet of lights, oblivious and beautiful. Below them, the Baltimore Rebirth Bridge was just a string of pearls, its celebration still bright, as if it had never known the taste of blood. 1 year later, the city breathed. The air, which had for so long been thick with the smog of corruption and fear, felt lighter. The sirens still sang their nightly song, but it was a song of ordinary problems, not a dirge for a city at war. The Iron Vow Syndicate, once an unshakable monolith, was now just a case study in federal law enforcement textbooks. Its spine had been ripped out, its head severed on a bridge of its own making. Damien Rourke had traded his shadowy crown for a plea deal. His testimony, delivered with the cold, surgical precision that had once defined his rule, had been the linchpin. He had walked the FBI and the Department of Justice through the labyrinth he had built, identifying every corrupt official, every compromised judge, every hidden ledger. The resulting political and corporate fallout had been seismic, cleaning house in a way no election ever could. His price was his freedom. He was no longer a king nor a ghost. He was, ironically, a consultant for the very economic crimes division he used to torment, a poacher turned master gamekeeper. He had traded his penthouse for a house by the river, its wide windows letting in the light. Elena, her side healed, the scar a thin, silvery map of her survival, had also begun to build. She had taken the liquidated, legitimate assets that Damien had signed over to her, everything that was not stained by the blood of the Iron Vow, and she had founded the Vance Foundation. It was headquartered in an old, refurbished library in the heart of the East Harbor, the very place her grief had begun. It provided legal aid, trauma counseling, and job placement for the women and children left in the wake of the city's violence. The widows who had once looked to her as an avenger now looked to her as an architect. The afternoon sun slanted across the polished wooden floor of the riverside house. Elena sat on a soft rug, patiently stacking colorful wooden blocks. A small, unsteady figure wobbled across the room, his dark hair catching the light. He had his mother's determined, watchful eyes and his father's stubborn, set jaw. Noah Rourke, a child conceived in shadow, now a year old, was taking his first confident steps in the light. He reached the tower of blocks, let out a bright, clear giggle, and, with a sweep of his small hand, knocked it all down. He looked up at his mother, his face beaming, waiting for applause. From the bay window, Damien watched them. He'd been standing there for a long time, watching the river, his reflection a quiet, pensive man he was still getting to know. On a small television in the corner, a local news anchor was reporting that the last of the major independent gangs, their infrastructure broken by the federal purge, had surrendered. It was the mark of a new, unfamiliar era. "You won," Damien said, his voice quiet, not turning from the glass. "The foundation, the widows, even the feds. You did what I, with all my armies and all my money, never could." He finally looked at her, a small, sad smile on his lips. "You are the one who truly owns this city, Elena." Elena looked at her son, who was now attempting to fit a square block into a round hole, his frustration mounting. She smiled, a soft, genuine expression that reached her eyes. "No, Damien," she said, her voice gentle but unwavering. "We're just learning how to stop letting it own us." Later that night, long after Noah was asleep, they stood on the small rooftop deck. It was not the staggering, godlike view from the penthouse. There was no skyline of conquered territory. There was just the broad, dark expanse of the river, the whisper of the wind in the reeds, and a blanket of stars overhead. It was, in a word, peaceful. Damien stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her hair. They stood in the comfortable silence, a language they had built together out of the wreckage. "I used to stand in my office," Sir, he said, his voice a low rumble against her, 45 floors up. "I would look down on all of it, the lights, the steel, the bridge, and I thought I was a king. I thought I owned it because I could bend it to my will." He turned her in his arms, his hands warm on her hips. His steel-colored eyes, once so cold, were now just clear, reflecting the starlight. He leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. "I was wrong," he whispered. "I was just a man guarding a fortress. I know now I wasn't the king. I was just keeping it safe until you arrived." Elena raised her hand, her fingers tracing the faint, silvery scar on his jaw, the one the fire had given him. She had come to know this face, this man, better than her own. She had seen his darkness, and she had chosen to light a match. "You're not the only one who owns this city, Damien," she replied, her voice soft, but as strong as the steel in the bridge that now bore a different name. "We both do." She put her hand over his, pressing it to her heart. In love, not in fear. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. It was not the desperate, angry collision of the warehouse, nor the tentative peace of the tunnel. It was a kiss of arrival, a promise kept. And from the open nursery window below, carried on the clean, quiet wind, the faint, happy sound of a child's laughter in his sleep, a new Baltimore, born from the ashes and redeemed. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from. Please comment below to connect and share your thoughts. Remember to subscribe to Mafia Boss Story, like this video, and support us by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.